The first time the bulldozer blade struck the old clay rise in Walter Boone's south pasture, the sound did not belong to dirt. It rang out hard and hollow. Metal. Buried metal. Walter killed the engine so fast the machine coughed once and died beneath the July sun. For a moment, the whole Alabama field went quiet except for the cicadas screaming from the pine trees and the low, frightened whine of his German shepherd. Duke was already standing at the edge of the broken mound, stiff-legged, ears high, staring into the fresh wound in the earth as if something inside it had finally answered him. Walter climbed down from the old caterpillar with one hand on the rail and the other pressed against his aching knee. He was 64 years old, broad-shouldered in the way former Marines stay broad long after youth leaves them, but grief and hard years had thinned him around the ribs. Sweat soaked the collar of his gray work shirt. Dust clung to the lines cut deep into his sunburned face. On his right forearm, half hidden beneath a rolled sleeve, was an old tattoo, the head of a German shepherd above the words "Never leave them behind." Duke whined again. The sound made Walter stop. The dog had been strange for weeks, maybe months. At night, Walter would wake around 2 in the morning and find Duke standing at the back porch, staring across the pasture toward that ugly mound of red clay and weeds near the dying oak tree. He never barked. He never ran after anything. He just watched, like a guard posted outside a door only he could see. Walter had told himself the dog was getting old. 8 years, maybe 9. He had never known Duke's exact age because the shepherd had shown up one winter morning half-starved and covered in frost, standing outside the barn like he had been assigned there. From the start, there had been something disciplined about him, something military. He never begged, never wandered, never flinched at thunder. But he hated that mound, and now Walter understood why. He stepped toward the broken clay. The air smelled of hot diesel, dry grass, and the distant rain that always seemed to threaten Boone Farm without ever reaching it. The mound was not natural, though for years Walter had let people call it a termite hill, a junk pile, a root ball, whatever made them stop asking. It had been there since before his father bought the land in 1948, a hard red rise covered with weeds, roots, and ant trails. The oil company surveyors had circled it last week and laughed. "Clear that out," one of them had said. "You'll get a cleaner easement and a better offer." A better offer? Walter almost laughed now, standing in the dust with his heart beating too hard. There was no better offer left. There was just debt. Hospital bills from 3 years of Margaret's cancer. Property taxes. Repair costs. Bank letters that arrived in clean white envelopes and somehow felt crueler than red ones. Boone Farm had belonged to his family for nearly 80 years, but grief had eaten through savings faster than drought killed crops. If Walter did not sell the back acreage soon, the bank would make the decision for him. That was why he had started clearing the south pasture that morning. That was why the blade had split open the clay. That was why Duke was now pawing at the dirt like a desperate thing. "Easy boy," Walter said. Duke ignored him. The shepherd dug at a jagged corner of something dark beneath the clay. Walter knelt, joints cracking, and brushed away soil with his fingers. At first he saw only rust, then a flat steel edge, then the faint outline of a lid. A box. A military lockbox. It was nearly black with age, sealed into the earth by roots and hardened red clay. Walter pulled more dirt away until the words across the lid came into view, faded but still readable beneath the corrosion. U.S. Marine Corps property. Walter stopped breathing. For several seconds, the Alabama heat seemed to vanish. He was not on his farm anymore. He was 20 years old again, standing in wet boots under fluorescent lights, smelling diesel, gun oil, canvas, and fear disguised as discipline. Duke pressed against his shoulder and gave a low, mournful sound. Walter stared at the box. "What in God's name are you doing under my field?" he whispered. Thunder rolled far beyond the pines. Walter fetched a crowbar from the bulldozer and worked it carefully beneath the rusted latch. The metal protested with a long, grinding squeal. He paused, suddenly aware of how alone he was out there. No workers. No family. No Margaret waiting on the porch with a glass of sweet tea and a warning not to overdo it. Only him. Only Duke. Only the thing the earth had hidden. The lock snapped. Walter lifted the lid. The smell came out first. Damp paper, old cloth, rust, and the stale breath of something sealed away too long. Inside were several objects wrapped in rotted military canvas. Walter removed the first bundle with both hands. A photograph. Water damage had eaten the edges, but the image remained. Two young Marines stood shoulder to shoulder beside a German shepherd wearing a canine harness. One Marine was blonde, barely 20, with a square jaw and a nervous smile. The dog sat proud and alert between them, one ear slightly bent. Walter turned the photo over. Written in faded ink were 5 words. Me and Bishop. October 1966. Duke sniffed the photograph, then pulled back as if the paper had burned him. Walter reached into the box again and found a set of dog tags blackened with age. He rubbed the metal clean with his thumb until the name appeared. Corporal Raymond Mercer, United States Marine Corps. The lid creaked higher. Beneath the photograph and the tags was a bundle of letters wrapped in a rotted green ribbon. Most were swollen from moisture. Their ink bled blue at the edges, but one envelope had survived well enough for Walter to read the single word on the front. MOM. He did not open it. He only held it for a moment, feeling the paper soften beneath the sweat of his fingers. A letter like that did not belong to curiosity. It belonged to a family. It belonged to a kitchen table, to a woman with tired eyes, to a mailbox checked too many times. Walter had written letters like that when he was young, before cell phones and satellite calls, and all the easy ways people now had to say they were alive. He remembered trying to sound brave for his mother. He remembered leaving out the bad parts. At the bottom of the lockbox sat one more object, sealed inside a cracked plastic sleeve. A cassette tape. The label had almost peeled away, but the date remained in black marker. October 14th, 1966. Walter stared at it with a coldness spreading beneath his ribs. A tape meant someone had known there might not be another chance to speak. A tape meant a man had recorded what paper could not carry. A tape meant fear had found a machine and asked it to remember. Duke sniffed the plastic sleeve once, then backed away and looked toward the old oak tree. The wind moved through the grass. Walter could hear the bulldozer cooling behind him with soft metallic ticks. He could hear thunder beyond the pines. He could hear his own breathing. And under all of it, in a place he would never be able to prove to another living soul, he thought he heard one deep bark rising from somewhere beneath the ground. Walter's mouth went dry. Mercer. He knew that name. Not well, not personally, but from the old stories men told at hardware stores and funeral homes when they thought children were not listening. His father had once mentioned a local boy, a Marine from Dry Creek, who vanished during a training operation before shipping overseas. Missing, they called him. No body, no funeral, no answers. Walter remembered one detail more than the rest. Raymond Mercer's mother kept her porch light burning every night until the day she died. The first drops of rain struck the clay around him. Walter sat back slowly, the dog tags cold in his palm despite the heat. He should have closed the box then and called the sheriff. Some old part of his training told him that. Secure the area. Preserve the evidence. Do not disturb remains or government property. But then Duke began digging again. Not at the box. At the earth below it. Duke, Walter warned. The shepherd dug harder, claws tearing through wet clay, breath coming fast through his nose. Walter reached for his collar, but before his fingers touched the dog, something pale appeared beneath the dirt. Not metal. Bone. Walter froze. Rain tapped gently against the mound, darkening the Alabama clay to the color of old blood. Duke stopped digging and stepped back, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the shallow hole. Walter did not touch what he saw. He had seen bones before. Every Marine who had been too close to war carried a private museum of things he wished he could unsee. But this was different. This was under his farm, under his pasture, under the land his wife had loved and his father had died protecting from developers. A fragment of bone, a strip of faded fabric, the rusted buckle of an old military web belt. Walter removed his cap. Jesus, he whispered. The rain thickened. Duke lowered his head and made a sound so soft and human that Walter felt it in his chest. He stood with effort, backed away from the disturbed ground, and pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands trembled as he dialed the county sheriff. "This is Walter Boone," he said when the dispatcher answered. "I need someone at my south pasture. Now, I found a military lockbox, dog tags, and what looks like human remains." The dispatcher asked him to repeat that. Walter looked down at Duke. The old dog had not moved from the edge of the grave. "You heard me," Walter said. "And tell them to send somebody who understands military recovery. This man has waited long enough." Before the state team sealed the lockbox as evidence, one of the investigators allowed Walter to stand in the kitchen while they documented the items. He did not touch anything. He did not ask to keep anything. He only watched while the cassette was photographed, bagged, logged, and then, after a brief argument between the sheriff and the federal man, copied onto a digital recorder for immediate review. The whole room changed when the tape began to play. Static came first, long and hollow, like rain falling inside a tunnel. Then a young man's voice broke through it. "My name is Corporal Raymond Mercer, United States Marine Corps. If anybody finds this, please tell my mother I did not run." No one in the kitchen moved. The investigator holding the recorder looked down at the table. Sheriff Daniels took off his hat. Walter gripped the back of a chair until his knuckles turned white. Duke, who had been lying near the door, rose to his feet and stared at the machine. Raymond's voice came through weakly, buried under hiss and distortion. He spoke of a fuel leak underground. Men ordered to move drums after midnight. A storage level that should have been empty, but was not. He said Bishop had refused to go near the south bunker 2 nights in a row. He said the dog had growled at an officer and nearly gotten himself shot for it. Then the tape crackled and skipped. When it settled, Raymond was breathing harder. "They are sealing the lower corridor," he whispered. "There are still men down here. Bishop is trapped past the fire door. I can hear him. I can hear him barking." A noise rose behind his words. A German shepherd barking somewhere inside metal and concrete. Duke answered it. One sharp bark. Everyone turned toward him. The old shepherd stood rigid, eyes shining in the kitchen light, as if the sound coming from that tape had crossed 60 years and called him by name. Raymond spoke again, softer now. "If I do not make it out, tell Mama I was not alone. Bishop stayed with me. I am going back for him." A Marine does not leave his partner in the dark. Then came shouting. Static. A deep metallic groan. One final bark. The tape ended. The silence that followed was worse than the recording. Walter looked toward the rain-streaked kitchen window. For an instant, he saw Margaret's reflection in the glass. Not as she was at the end, thin and tired, but as she had been 20 years earlier, strong and smiling on that porch. Then the reflection was gone, and only his own old face stared back. Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat, but his voice still broke. "We are going to find him," he said. Walter looked down at Duke. "No," he answered quietly. Duke already did. By sundown, Boone Farm was no longer quiet. Sheriff's deputies blocked the dirt road with cruisers. Rain flashed blue and red under their lights. The county coroner arrived in a white van, followed by 2 state investigators and a thin man from the Department of Defense who looked too young to be carrying the weight of dead men in his briefcase. Walter stood beneath the porch roof with Duke at his side, watching strangers move through his pasture under portable floodlights. They photographed the box. They marked the ground. They covered the exposed remains with a clean white sheet and treated the site with the kind of silence Walter respected. No one laughed. No one called it a junk pile. No one said better offer. Near midnight, Sheriff Daniels walked back to the porch, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Walter," he said carefully, "you did right calling this in." Walter looked past him to the field. "Do you know who he is?" "Not officially. Not yet. But the dog tags say Raymond Mercer. We will confirm through records." Walter nodded once. Duke suddenly lifted his head toward the south pasture and growled. The men on the porch went still. Across the field, beyond the lights and yellow tape, the dying oak tree stood in the rain. For 1 second, lightning split the sky open and washed the pasture white. Walter saw something beside the broken mound. A tall figure. A young man in shadow. Then the lightning vanished, and there was nothing there but rain. Sheriff Daniels looked at him. "You all right?" Walter did not answer. Duke kept staring into the dark. The next morning, Walter drove into Dry Creek with the copied inventory list one of the investigators had allowed him to see and the photograph of Raymond and Bishop sealed in a plastic sleeve. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his own wife on the porch at sunset, waiting for him to come in from the fields. Somebody else had waited too. For 60 years, Dry Creek, Alabama, was the kind of town that looked smaller every time a person returned to it. Brick storefronts faded by heat. A courthouse clock tower that had been wrong since 1978. A barber pole that still turned though the barber had died 2 summers earlier. Flags hanging from porches because people there believed memory was a civic duty. Walter parked outside the Dry Creek Historical Society beneath an old magnolia, dripping rainwater onto cracked pavement. Duke climbed out beside him and stayed close. Inside, the building smelled of dust, coffee, and old paper. Framed photographs of veterans lined the walls. In one, Walter's own father stood among men in work shirts and service caps after the Korean War, looking younger than Walter could ever remember him. Behind the desk sat Eleanor Whitaker, 73 years old, sharp-eyed, silver-haired, and impossible to surprise. She looked up over her glasses. "Walter Boone," she said. "I must be dying." "Not today," Walter replied. Her eyes moved to Duke, then to the plastic sleeve in Walter's hand. The humor left her face. "What did you find?" Walter laid the photograph on the desk. Eleanor did not touch it at first. She only stared. "Raymond Mercer," she whispered. The name seemed to change the temperature in the room. An hour later, they sat at a long archive table beneath buzzing fluorescent lights while Eleanor turned pages in a newspaper binder yellowed by time. Duke lay under Walter's chair, but his eyes followed every sound in the building. Eleanor stopped at a front page dated November 3rd, 1966. Local Marines still missing after training accident. Below the headline was a photograph of a young woman standing on a farmhouse porch beside two older parents. The woman held a folded handkerchief so tightly it looked like a wound in her hand. "His mother," Eleanor said softly. "Martha Mercer." His sister Clara was only 16 then. Walter read the article in silence. The government had called it a fuel storage fire near a temporary military training site outside Dry Creek. One Marine missing. Several personnel injured. Investigation pending. There had been no follow-up. That training site, Walter said, already knowing the answer. Eleanor pulled another folder from a gray cabinet and laid out an aerial photograph. Black and white. Grainy. Marked with survey notes. Walter leaned over it. His pulse changed. The image showed his south pasture, but not as he knew it. No fences. No cattle trails. No wild grass. Instead, there were temporary barracks, fuel sheds, narrow roads, and two round access hatches near the same dying oak tree that now marked the edge of his field. "Before your father bought the farm," Eleanor said, "the government leased that tract for joint training operations during the Vietnam buildup. Mostly fuel transport, storage, and canine security. At least, that is what the surviving records say." Surviving? She looked at him. Most of the files disappeared after 1967. The town asked questions for a while. Then people got tired, or scared, or poor. Those three things can bury the truth faster than dirt. Walter stared at the photograph. Duke rose suddenly beneath the table and faced the dark hallway between the archive shelves. A low growl rolled out of him. Eleanor looked down. "That dog has been doing that since he came in." Walter followed Duke's eyes. There was nothing in the hallway. Only shelves. Only dust. Only old names waiting in boxes. Eleanor slid one more page toward him. It was a personnel inventory sheet from October 1966. Most of the ink had faded, but one line near the bottom was still readable. K9 unit. Bishop. Status. Missing. Eleanor found more than newspaper clippings. She found town council notes from 1967, when 3 farmers complained about sick cattle near the old leased land. She found a letter from the county doctor asking the state health office whether fuel exposure could cause burns on the lungs. She found a handwritten note from a deputy who had tried to interview guards posted at the training site and was told to leave before he was arrested. None of it proved everything. Old records rarely did. But together they formed the outline of a truth that had been deliberately blurred. Walter read each page with the patience of a man assembling a body from bones. What hurt most was not the government language. It was the ordinary language around it. Bake sale announcements next to missing person updates. Church picnic photographs beside reports of military trucks moving at night. The world had continued in small-town fashion while one mother waited at a window and one sister grew old without an answer. People wanted to talk, Eleanor said. Then the calls came. Men in suits. Men with badges. The county needed federal road money. Farmers needed loans. The paper needed advertising. After a while, silence became easier than courage. Walter did not judge them quickly. He had seen fear work on good people. He had seen how families with mortgages and sick children learned to swallow questions. But he also knew silence had a cost, and that cost was usually paid by the dead. He looked at the aerial photograph again. Two hatches. One near the oak tree. One closer to the mound. The distance between them matched the path Duke had watched from the porch all those nights. He was not staring at the mound, Walter said slowly. Eleanor looked up. He was watching the line between the grave and the hatch. Duke, beneath the table, let out a quiet breath and settled his head on his paws. Walter read it twice. Then a third time. They lost the dog too, he said. Eleanor's voice dropped. Walter, people said for years that Raymond did not die in the fire. They said he went back underground because his dog was trapped. Walter closed his eyes. In that moment, Duke pressed his head against Walter's knee. Not begging, not afraid, reminding him. That afternoon, Walter returned to Boone Farm and found the investigators gone from the field, their equipment covered and guarded until a federal recovery team could arrive the next morning. Yellow tape moved softly in the wind around the broken clay rise. The grave had been protected. The lockbox had been removed as evidence. But the old oak tree stood 50 yards beyond the site, untouched. Duke walked straight toward it. Duke, Walter called. The shepherd did not slow. Walter followed, boots sinking into damp ground. The air was heavy after rain, carrying the smell of wet grass, pine needles, and something metallic he could not name. Fireflies had begun to flicker along the fence line. Evening sat low over the pasture. Duke stopped at the base of the oak tree and pawed once at the mud. Hollow. Walter aimed his flashlight down. Half hidden beneath roots and weeds was a rusted circular hatch. His breath caught. The steel was almost swallowed by the earth, but yellow lettering remained beneath the grime. Restricted access. Government property. Walter took one step back. Every instinct in him said not to open it. He had already done the right thing once. He had called the sheriff. Evidence was evidence. Old military sites could hold gas pockets, unstable walls, contaminated soil, things that killed men who thought courage was the same as intelligence. But Duke lowered himself beside the hatch and began to whine. Not at the metal, at something below it. Walter called Sheriff Daniels again. This time, he did not wait. Alone. Within an hour, deputies returned. By dark, a state hazmat officer and two military recovery specialists stood over the hatch with lights, masks, and equipment Walter did not pretend to understand. He stayed behind the tape where they told him to stand, one hand resting on Duke's neck. The men opened the hatch near 10 o'clock. A breath of cold air rose from the ground. It smelled like damp concrete, rust, and time. One specialist lowered a camera down first. The image appeared on a small monitor. Concrete steps descending into black water-stained darkness. Pipes overhead. Old wires. A collapsed sign reading Storage Level C. Then the camera turned. Something lay near the far wall. A leather collar. A chain bolted to the floor. Walter heard one of the men curse softly. Duke stood so suddenly Walter had to grip his collar. The camera moved closer. A brass nameplate came into focus beneath dust and corrosion. Bishop. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the camera operator continued deeper into the chamber. Past rusted fuel drums. Past broken crates. Past warning signs faded almost white. Near a sealed steel door, partially covered by collapsed debris, lay another set of remains. Smaller. A dog. Beside it was a canine harness. Walter felt his throat close. Duke made a low sound and leaned his full weight against Walter's leg. The specialist holding the monitor lowered his voice. We have a military working dog down there. Looks like he died near the sealed door. Walter looked at the screen. The camera light drifted across the rusted steel door behind the remains. Scratched into it by hand were words that had waited 60 years to be read. We were never supposed to die here. Beneath the words was a faded red stamp. Classified. The recovery did not become easy once the story became public. Truth rarely makes things simple. A military site from the 1960s meant old hazards, missing maps, liability questions, and men in offices trying to decide which words would sound least guilty on television. For 2 days, Walter watched experts argue over ground-penetrating radar, contamination boundaries, and whether the bunker should be opened farther or sealed until a larger team arrived from out of state. He did not understand all of it, but he understood delay. Delay was what had kept Martha Mercer waiting. Delay was what had turned a son into a rumor. So when a public affairs officer suggested that the site remain unnamed until the investigation was properly contextualized, Walter stepped in front of 3 cameras at the gate and told the truth as plainly as he could. His name was Raymond Mercer, he said. His dog's name was Bishop. They were found on my land. Their family deserves answers before anyone protects a reputation. The clip spread faster than Walter expected. By evening, veterans groups were calling. A canine memorial organization from Georgia offered help. A retired military handler drove 4 hours just to stand by the fence and salute the pasture. Strangers left flowers at the gate. One envelope arrived with no return address and a note written in shaky handwriting. My father served there. He never spoke of it, but he woke up barking in his sleep for the rest of his life. Walter read that note twice, then placed it on the kitchen table beside Margaret's Bible. Not every ghost belonged to the ground. Some lived in men who came home and never found the language to explain what followed them. By sunrise, federal vehicles lined the road to Boone Farm. Reporters arrived before breakfast. They parked beyond the gate and stood in wet grass with cameras and microphones, whispering as if the field itself were a church. Military recovery teams set up white tents over the mound and the hatch. Men and women in protective suits moved carefully between them. No one rushed. No one joked. Even the young deputies who usually laughed too loud at diner counters kept their voices low. Walter watched from the fence line with Duke seated at his left side. A retired Marine colonel named David Hargrove arrived around noon. He was tall, white-haired, and too formal for a muddy pasture. Yet when he reached Walter, he removed his cap before speaking. "Mr. Boone," he said, "what you uncovered here is significant." Walter looked toward the recovery tent. Significant is a small word. Hargrove accepted that with a slight nod. The preliminary records identify this as a temporary Defense Department fuel testing and transport site active in 1966. A containment failure occurred in October of that year. The official report described it as a storage fire. And the real report? The colonel's face did not change, but his eyes did. The real report appears to have been sealed. Walter stared at him. A Marine and his dog were left under my field, and somebody sealed the report. I cannot speak for men who made decisions before I was commissioned. That is convenient. It is not meant to be. Walter turned away. Across the pasture, 2 recovery workers emerged from the hatch carrying a sealed container draped in a clean military cloth. Everyone nearby stopped moving. Even the reporters lowered their cameras. Duke stood. The container passed slowly through the grass. Another followed later, smaller, carried with the same care. Walter did not cry. He had not cried when Margaret's doctor said the cancer had spread. He had not cried at the funeral. He had not cried when he came home afterward and saw her coffee mug still in the sink. But his eyes burned then, because the truth was simple and terrible. Raymond Mercer had not disappeared. Bishop had not run away. They had been waiting beneath Boone Farm, while above them the world kept moving. That evening, Eleanor Whitaker came to the farmhouse carrying a cardboard box against her chest. Walter sat on the porch with Duke at his feet. The field beyond the house glowed under floodlights. Work continued through the fading daylight. Eleanor sat beside him without asking. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she handed him the box. "I found these in the archives after you left," she said. Walter opened it. Inside were dozens of unopened letters, bound with faded ribbon. Every envelope was addressed to Corporal Raymond Mercer. Walter touched the top, one gently. His mother? Eleanor nodded. She wrote to him for years after the government stopped answering. Christmas, birthdays, every October. She brought the letters to the post office even after the postmaster told her there was nowhere to send them. Finally, he started saving them instead of throwing them away. Walter looked toward the south pasture. Did she ever know? No. She died in 1992. Still waiting. The porch chimes moved softly in the evening wind. Margaret's chimes. Walter had nearly taken them down after she died because the sound hurt too much. Now he was glad he had not. Duke lifted his head suddenly and looked toward the road. A dark sedan had stopped at the gate. A woman stepped out slowly. She was in her 70s, silver hair tucked beneath a rain hood, one hand gripping the car door as if she needed the metal to remain upright. She stared across the field for a long time before walking toward the porch. Walter stood. The woman stopped at the bottom step. "Mr. Boone," she asked. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes moved past him to the lights in the field. "My name is Clara Mercer. Raymond was my brother." The air seemed to leave the porch. Walter came down the steps slowly. He did not offer words right away because some moments were too large for words and too fragile for comfort. Clara looked toward the south pasture. Mama waited every evening, she said. She sat by the front window with the porch light on. Every car that slowed down, she thought it might be someone coming to tell her where he was. Walter swallowed hard. Duke walked forward then, calm in a way he rarely was with strangers. He stopped in front of Clara and rested his head gently against her shaking hand. Clara stared down at him. Then she broke. Clara stayed on the porch long after Eleanor left. Walter made coffee, though neither of them drank much. They sat beneath Margaret's wind chimes while Duke slept between them, his body positioned so that one paw touched Walter's boot and the other nearly touched Clara's shoe. Clara told him Raymond had wanted to become a veterinarian after the service. She said he had brought home every injured animal he found as a boy: possums, barn cats, a crow with a broken wing, even a neighbor's mean old hound that bit him twice before deciding Raymond was worth trusting. When he joined the Marines, their mother cried for 3 days. When he wrote home about Bishop, she said it was the first time she slept through the night. She believed that dog would bring him back, Clara said. Walter looked down at Duke. Maybe he did, he answered. Clara opened one of the old letters and read a few lines. Her mother's words were ordinary, which somehow made them devastating. She wrote about the church roof leaking, about Clara learning to drive, about the pear tree blooming early, about saving Raymond a plate at Thanksgiving just in case. At the bottom of every letter, the same sentence appeared. The porch light is on. Clara folded the paper carefully and held it against her chest. I used to hate that light, she whispered. When I was young, I thought it kept our family trapped. Now I think it was the only way Mama knew how to fight. Walter thought of all the nights he had left his own porch light off after Margaret died because darkness felt more honest. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe a light was not denial. Maybe it was defiance. That night, before Clara went inside to sleep in the guest room, Walter walked to the porch switch and turned the light on. He left it burning until morning. The sound that came out of her was not loud, but it seemed to pass through the whole farm. Walter stepped closer, and Clara leaned into him like family, like grief had known the route all along and had simply been waiting for someone to open the gate. 3 days later, the rain finally stopped. Morning sunlight poured warm and gold across Boone Farm, turning the wet grass silver and filling the pasture with the smell of pine, mud, and fresh earth. The old clay rise had been carefully removed. In its place stood rows of small American flags marking the recovery site. White tents still covered the hatch and the sealed bunker entrance, but that morning the machinery was silent. No engines, no radios, no shouted orders, only stillness. Walter Boone stood near the dying oak tree wearing his marine dress jacket for the first time in more than 20 years. It fit tighter than it used to. The buttons strained slightly. His hair was more silver than brown now. But when he put it on that morning, something inside him had straightened. Duke sat beside him, brushed clean, amber eyes watching the people gather across the field. Cars lined the dirt road all the way back toward the highway. Veterans in faded caps, farmers in work boots, reporters standing farther off than usual, as if even they understood where the line was. Families from Dry Creek, men and women who had never met Raymond Mercer but knew what it meant for a son not to come home. At the front stood Clara, holding one of her mother's letters against her chest. 2 caskets rested beneath a white canopy, one for Corporal Raymond Mercer, one smaller casket for Bishop. The canine harness recovered from the bunker had been cleaned and folded across the smaller casket. Beside it lay the brittle leather collar with the brass nameplate. Duke stared at it without moving. Colonel Hargrove approached Walter before the ceremony began. He looked older than he had 3 days earlier. We confirmed the remains, he said quietly. Corporal Mercer and military working dog Bishop. The evidence suggests Mercer went back into the lower level after the containment failure because Bishop was still inside. The door sealed behind them during the shutdown. Walter looked at the caskets. He could have run. Yes, but he stayed with his dog. The colonel nodded. Walter rested his hand on Duke's neck. No, he said softly. They stayed with each other. The ceremony began beneath a cloudless Alabama sky. A chaplain spoke first. He spoke of duty, sacrifice, and loyalty, but the words that mattered most were the simplest ones. Some are lost because no one looks hard enough, he said. Some are found because love refuses to stop looking. Clara wept quietly through the service, her mother's letter pressed to her heart. When the honor guard folded the American flag and placed it in her hands, the field stood motionless. A young Marine knelt before her. "On behalf of a grateful nation," he said. Clara closed her eyes. "Mama waited every day," she whispered. "Every single day." Then came the second flag, smaller, folded with the same care, placed beside Bishop's collar. That was when many people in the crowd looked away, not because it was less important, but because it was too human. A dog who had been given a duty had kept it until his last breath. A Marine who had been given a partner had refused to abandon him. Duke stood. Walter did not command him. He did not touch him. He only watched as the old German shepherd walked slowly across the grass toward the smaller casket. Hundreds of people fell silent. Duke stopped beside Bishop's casket, lowered himself into the grass, and rested his gray muzzle against the wood. No one moved. Even the cameras lowered. Walter felt something inside him open, something he had kept locked since Margaret died. He thought of her standing on the porch at sunset. He thought of Raymond's mother by the window. He thought of Bishop in the dark. He thought of Duke, who had guarded a truth no human could hear. The rifle salute cracked across the pasture. Birds lifted from the pine trees. Clara flinched but held the flag tight. Duke did not move. After the salute, an elderly man in a wheelchair asked to be pushed forward. His cap read Vietnam veteran in gold thread. He had not spoken to reporters. He had not introduced himself to Walter. But when he reached Clara, he lifted a trembling hand. "I was stationed 2 counties over in '66, he said. "We heard about a fire. We heard men were missing. They told us it was none of our business." Clara knelt beside him. The old veteran's eyes filled. "I am sorry," he said. "I was 19. I believed orders were the same as truth." Clara took his hand. "You came today," she said. "That matters." Walter watched the exchange from a few steps away and understood that the ceremony was not only for Raymond and Bishop. It was for everyone who had carried a version of that silence. It was for the men who obeyed because they were young, the families who suspected but could not prove, the town that learned to look away, and the living who still had time to do better. When the crowd thinned, Clara walked to the smaller casket and placed one of her mother's letters beneath Bishop's folded harness. "She would have wanted you to have one too," Clara whispered. "You kept him company when we couldn't." Duke lifted his head, watching her. For a moment, the wind stopped. When the service ended, people drifted slowly through the field, speaking in low voices. Some shook Walter's hand. Some thanked him. Some only touched Duke's head and walked away crying. Near sunset, Colonel Hargrove returned with a document folder. "This is not final protection," he said, handing it to Walter. "But the department is placing an emergency preservation hold on the property until the historical review is complete. No drilling, no development, no sale pressure tied to the easement. Not until this site is fully investigated and memorialized." The next week did not bring clean answers. It brought forms, interviews, soil tests, and official language that tried to make a tragedy sound manageable. Walter sat through all of it because Clara asked him to. She wanted one person in every room who had seen the field before it became a headline. Someone who would not let Raymond and Bishop turn into case numbers. On Friday morning, a young reporter asked Walter what he hoped people would take from the story. He almost refused to answer. He disliked cameras. He disliked the way tragedy could become content before grief had even sat down. But Duke stood beside him, calm and steady, and Walter thought about the tape, the porch light, and the words scratched into the steel door. So he answered, "I hope people remember that loyalty is not a feeling," he said. "It is a decision. Raymond made it. Bishop made it. Duke made it when he would not stop watching that field. And the rest of us have to decide whether we are loyal to the truth after it becomes inconvenient." The reporter lowered her microphone slightly. That was the only quote Walter gave. By evening, veterans from across the county had begun placing small stones along the fence line. Some wrote names on them. Some wrote dates. One stone had only 3 words painted in black. "I came home." Walter stood over that one for a long time, understanding that the story had opened more than a bunker. It had opened private rooms inside people who had been carrying their own missing pieces for decades. Boone Farm changed after that, but not in the way Walter feared. It did not become a tourist stop. The sheriff made sure of that. It became quieter, if anything. More careful. People who visited came slowly. They lowered their voices. They touched the fence post near the flags and left without taking anything. For the first time since Margaret died, Walter found himself making coffee for visitors again. Clara came most mornings. Eleanor brought archive copies and gossip in equal measure. Sheriff Daniels stopped by even when he had no reason to. The house that had once seemed too large for one grieving man began to hold voices again. And every night, before bed, Walter turned on the porch light. Walter stared at the paper. For weeks, he had believed losing the land was inevitable. Now the government that had once buried its secret beneath his farm was the only reason the farm might survive. Life had a cruel sense of balance. He looked across the pasture. Fresh earth covered the recovery area. Small flags moved in the golden light. Clara stood near the caskets, reading one of her mother's letters aloud in a voice too soft for anyone but Raymond to hear. Duke came back to Walter's side and leaned against his leg. The old dog was tired. So was Walter. But the farm no longer felt empty. Not haunted. Remembered. That night, after everyone left and the last official vehicle disappeared down the dirt road, Walter sat on the porch with Duke beside him. The air was warm. Cicadas sang from the pines. Margaret's wind chimes moved gently overhead. The south pasture lay quiet beneath the moon. For the first time in years, Walter did not feel like he was waiting for loss to take something else from him. He looked down at Duke. "You knew," he said. The shepherd's ears twitched. Walter smiled faintly through tired eyes. "You brought them home." Duke lowered his head onto Walter's boot and closed his eyes. Across the field, near the old oak tree, the flags moved softly in the night wind. And for one brief moment, Walter imagined another dog standing there in the moonlight beside a young Marine who had finally stopped waiting. Then the porch light flickered once. Not from the storm, not from bad wiring, just once. A quiet flash of gold against the dark. Walter did not move. He only sat there with his hand resting on Duke's head, listening to the wind pass through the grass, and understood. Something Margaret had tried to tell him for years. The dead do not always ask us to follow them. Sometimes they only ask us to remember. And sometimes, if we are lucky, a loyal dog leads us to the place where remembrance begins.